think it's about time. Hello everybody, welcome to Wonky and where we talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, finally, I'm talking about the new album from Orbital. Monsters Exist. Orbital. Paul and Phil Hartnell. I really do not think we need an introduction to these guys on this channel. But if in case you missed it, they are my personal favorite band of all time. Having introduced me to the world of electronic music when I was only in 5th grade, and made so many albums and tracks over the years that have meant so much to me. I've done an entire discography review on them, where I went down all their albums in great detail, and even their solo side projects. You can check the link in the description if you want to hear my full thoughts on all the other stuff they released, and even watch the list of my top 20 favorite tracks of theirs, because I couldn't stop at just 10. I have so much gushing over all their stuff, and can't even begin to describe their effect on my life in a succinct way. I guess I may as well quickly go down their mainline studio album discography so far, though. One of my least favorite albums of theirs, actually, just kind of them forming their style and going from there, but still pretty consistently awesome. The album with Halcyon, Impact, Lush, and Planet of the Shapes, kind of a life-defining album here. Don't miss. Much stranger album from them with a lot of elements of social commentary, pretty great stuff, though it doesn't become incredible until the second half, personally. 10 out of 10, favorite album of all time, period. No exaggeration there. Solid front to back, awesome dramatic epic pump-up stuff, maybe not a huge standout in their catalog, but being amazing is the norm for them. Why this is condemned by so many, including Paul and Phil themselves, is beyond me. It's one of the craziest albums I've ever heard, yet super well thought out. Incredibly underrated, check it out. First CD I ever bought. Maybe not as good as previous albums, but still a lot of fun. This was their comeback after breaking up the first time. One of the weaker albums, probably even the weakest, but the best stuff on here is some of the best stuff they've ever done. Also, yes, this album is where the Wonky in the name of my channel comes from. Which brings us to here. Now, Wonky came out back in 2012 when I was in high school. Since then, geez, so much has happened. The years following have been quite the emotional roller coaster. They broke up a second time in 2014 and formed their separate solo careers. Paul put out solo projects like the excellent 858 and the mildly fun but underwhelming in retrospect 2 Square with Vince Clarke, and Phil didn't put out any music of his own but instead performed as a DJ regularly. But then, right at the beginning of 2017, suddenly they announced that they were back again. And later on even came out with a brand new single called Copenhagen. Also Kinetic 2017, but it doesn't really matter as much. I was so excited at the prospect of Orbital finally being back, and when I listened to this comeback single, I thought it was fine. It was fine. While probably a better single than, say, Never, and one that grew on me, it still kinda read to me as a wonky leftover. It was definitely an Orbital track that no one else could have made, but there wasn't anything really interesting it gave me to say about it, and aside from one admittedly good chopped up vocal hook and some pretty hard-hitting 80s-ish synth stabs in the second half, it just didn't really stick with me. And I'd never put it anywhere near my personal favorites they've done. It was a little worrying. But then they announced that a 9th album was on the way and released a live set with 2 other new tracks on it called P.H.U.K and Tiny Foldable Cities, both of which were later released as standalone singles as well. And when I first heard both of these tracks in the live set, honestly I was pretty underwhelmed with them too. Kinda had the same reaction to them that I did to Copenhagen. Tiny Foldable Cities was at least more interesting and didn't sound quite like other things they'd done before, but I couldn't say the same about P.H.U.K at the time, or honestly mark either track as anything all that amazing. I told myself, don't worry, these are just demos, when they release the tracks themselves, they'll be better. And when both of these singles were released in full, I did in fact like both of them much more when stretched out to their fullest extent. Maybe P.H.U.K could have used a little better mixing, but that could be better on the album, and it's certainly best in its full 7-minute form. I was honestly dreading this album for months, but the third single, The End Is Nigh, was the first pre-album single I liked immediately. Being weird in a way I hadn't heard from Orbital before, and vaguely reminding me of deep cuts from the Altogether or the Blue album, which I feel are too often overlooked. It partially quelled my biggest fear of the album basically becoming Wonky 2.0 and just kinda being boring. And by that point, the other two singles had grown on me more than Copenhagen ever did. At that point, I went from dreading the album to regular anticipating it, just like I normally would for any new Orbital album. There was the issue of my knowing that I'd already heard the longest track on the album, and that once again we were not going to get a big long epic that we haven't gotten anything like since One Perfect Sunrise. The mere presence of a 10+ minute track could have basically forgiven all my misgivings going into this and instantly made me regular anticipate this album. And even if there isn't one, it could still end up like the Blue Album or 858 and satisfy me in other ways. But whatever this album was going to be, it was still Orbital. It was highly unlikely that I wouldn't like it, but I was hoping more than anything that I would more than just like it. So, without any further ado, what do we get with Monsters Exist? Well, I got my wish. It is not Wonky. At all. It still definitely sounds like Orbital, but Monsters Exist doesn't sound like any previous Orbital album. If people weren't happy with their last couple of projects feeling too commercial or something like that, this album definitely won't be finding its way on any pop charts. Because Monsters Exist shows Paul and Phil at their most abstract, strange, and left field. And not strange in the way the Altogether is strange either. I mean, the songs themselves are super abstract and odd. A lot of them are packed with non-linear structures and quirky synth sounds, a lot like Plaid actually, but presented in a dark and foreboding way that's still pretty accessible like Orbital can deliver. In fact, the title and album cover are the best way of describing what this album is like. And ignore the fact that the album cover just happens to resemble the cover of Insides. It's covered in weird, nightmarish alien creatures that look really gross or like they're out to get you or something. Though whether or not they're actually friendly is up to you. And similarly, the various pieces of Monsters Exist feel packed with weird alien noises, sometimes creating the stuff of nightmares, but sometimes feeling a little friendlier. But even in the latter case, tends to be quite off the wall and odd. And in the end, the weird monsters on the cover aren't real. They're made out of familiar-looking objects like balloons and car hubcaps. Everything in the air is suspended by wires. It's nothing really to be afraid of. Like how all the actual synth sounds that go into the album are the same kinds of sounds they've always used, especially on their later period work like the Blue Album and Wonky. But they're presented in such weird ways that you're never sure what to make of it. Orbital are creating a challenging listen that still has those rewards waiting for whoever wants to put forth the effort into exploring whatever disgusting depths they've created. And I will admit, the somewhat Plaid-like nature of this album did make it really hard for me to parse my feelings on it and figure out where it would fit in their discography. Part of the problem is simply the fact that there's no nostalgia factor here and the album's brand new. I'm gonna mention this a lot, sorry. It's really surreal for me trying to wrap my head around a new Orbital album at all, especially within this close proximity to its release, and especially one this abstract. I felt like I wouldn't be qualified to talk about it until I've listened to it like 30 times and knew it roughly as well as the other Orbital albums. And so far I've listened to it 13 times. Figured that was a fitting number to get ready for the review. And I will say that every track on this thing has gotten stuck in my head at some point, aside from Buried Deep Within. Its lack of a nostalgia factor is a serious mark against my personal enjoyment. But by the same token, I think it has much more of a backbone than other more recent Orbital albums. I can tell you for sure, I think it's better than Wonky, and I'm fairly certain I'd rank it higher than the Blue Album as well. There may not be any track on Monsters Exists that hits the same heights as the last two tracks from Wonky or One Perfect Sunrise, but it is really solid and well put together, certainly better thought out than either Wonky or the Blue Album. In fact, I think it's also better than 858 as well. The thing about that album is that it works really well as a whole, but none of the individual tracks taken out of context are all that special by themselves. Monsters Exist also works really well as a whole, though I can take any track out of context and most of them will work perfectly fine. But on the other hand, Monsters Exist also is not the 6 to 9 out of 10 that I was looking for. Namely because Orbital do have one other similarly challenging listen in their previous catalog that also happened to be similarly pissed off about the state of the world we live in. A little album called Snivelization. Now I do think Monsters Exist is much easier for me to get into than the first half of that album, mainly because the production and mixing is a lot more satisfying. It's not the kind of thing where I have to be in the right mood this time. My enjoyment of this album has been a lot more consistent. But Snivelization still has that incredible second half. Monsters Exist doesn't have anything even close to the level of Are We Here or even A Kind Drink Wasser or Attached. There were a couple of tracks that feel like maybe had potential to hit that level if they got extended outwards and had more elements introduced, but ultimately felt like they were cut short before they got the chance to live out that potential. That's not to say said tracks don't work the way they are currently, just saying that's probably what it would have taken to get Monsters Exist up to that 9 out of 10 level. There isn't any big 10-minute epic here or a track that just throws me over the top like that, but I do think it is really solid and really well put together. So let's finally talk about individual tracks. Alright. So the opener and title track took me a while to fully get into. It didn't seem like that big a standout to me at first, though it was a good indication on what you're getting into. But it is one of the biggest growers on this album. Every time I heard it, it got a little catchier, and now I know it just as well as the pre-album singles. I think the moment at which it fully clicked with me was when the official Orbital Twitter posted a clip of Paul likening this track to a psychedelic theme tune for some propaganda-spewing news program, which I thought was really spot on, and I can't unhear that now. Like you're watching a broadcast of someone telling you, beware of these monsters which are everywhere but you can't see them, trying to make you more paranoid and fear-mongering and all that stuff. But yeah, that track just gets better and better every time I hear it. There's so much detail and it sets the tone excellently. Then we get to Hoo Hoo Ha Ha, which seems to be the popular choice for worst track on the album right now. I actually remember this being a leftover from 858, because Paul posted one of those, squiggle line maps of his work in progress for that album on Twitter a really long time ago, and because I was a lot more obsessive fan that back then I saved the pick. And Hoo Hoo Ha Ha was on that map, so it's been around a really long time. That said, this would not have fit at all on 858, and it only barely fits on this album. I mean, I suppose technically it's my least favorite, as it's one of the thinnest tracks on the album that has little more to it than repetitive chopped up samples and a playful trumpet line. But I do actually really like this track as well, since that trumpet line is easily one of the catchiest melodies on the album. Could get that one stuck in my head after 2 listens. And the whole track kind of reminds me of something that could have fit on the Altogether, not unlike crazier tracks from there like Oi or Tootled or Waving Not Drowning. Not quite as frantic or over the top as those, just similarly silly. And while it is maybe a little out of place on this album, which is typically a lot darker across the board, I will say it still works as it evokes the kind of imagery you see on the album cover, provided they turn some more lights on. Not an incredible track, but still one I undoubtedly enjoy. The Raid, meanwhile, is the kind of thing that if you'd given it to middle schooler me, it'd have scared me stiff, just like You Lottin' Out There Somewhere Part 2 did. Possibly even more so. It's just incredibly dark and rough, and those ranting voice samples. This is what your descendants will know. A featureless, life-despising mess whose only message is that life is a prison. I agree with you! I say what you do about the world! It's poison! Yeah! And it's sick! Yeah! And you want to get out of it, out of it, out of it, out of it! Just really nasty and uncomfortable sounds all around, but brought together by a lead alien melodic pad. It's not one of the catchiest tracks on here, but it is really awesome whenever it comes on. Then we got the singles. As I said before, P.H.U.K has grown on me a ton since my first listen, where I thought it was too traditional for Orbital and out of the box enough. I mean, P.H.U.K, I thought, okay, acid, duh. But I like how it stands for Please Help UK, because the UK's in the shitter. And now I've practically memorized the way it goes, how it shifts through 2 more ambient build-ups and 2 more hard-hitting drops, with a nice outro to change things up at the end. While there are plenty of Orbital tracks that sound vaguely similar to it already, it has really stuck with me, and by this point, little details like the half a second of a tambourine in part of the outro now get me really energized. And it's worth noting this is one of the tracks that I feel like they could have stretched out even further if they wanted to. Once the outro shows up, on my first couple listens of this album version, I was like, oh boy, that's the perfect time to change and evolve into something else. And then the track ended. I mean, you could have kept going, building on those core ideas, maybe take a couple from the bonus tracks, since those are basically all just demos anyways. like, I don't know, Kaiju for instance, and bring back the main melody and boom, you can have yourself a nice meaty 9-10 minute track just like the old days. Oh well, I suppose this is meaty enough. I've gotten used to the way the track is now and Tiny Foldable Cities just showing up immediately after anyways. Speaking of Tiny Foldable Cities, while probably my least favorite of the 3 pre-album singles right now, it is easily the most indicative of the singles for what you were getting into with the album. Just a dark, stormy, and heavily detailed mess of various kinds of synth bleeping. Really does feel like it's creating a city full of busy people and cars that are moving at high speed around you, like in the box video. And I will say it benefits heavily from my having known it ahead of time for so long and knowing where all the details go. But there are a number of tracks here that are similarly detailed and sci-fi soundtrack, like, for instance, the next track, Buried Deep Within. The only track on here that I have yet to get stuck in my head at some point, but I still really love it. Like, it starts out subtle, almost ambient, but then the beat comes in, the track starts to pick up more, and the whole thing sounds absolutely beautiful. And the wobbling bass synths and crunching, like, rock sounds. Not rock as in the music, rock as in rocks on the ground. This kind of stuff makes you feel like you're like really deep underground or digging downwards into a dark tunnel. And I mean, its lack of catchiness and generally not standing out melody-wise are easily made up for just by the sound design. Similar thoughts on Vision on E. Nice. Which feels more like a psychedelic drug trip, of course, and has a much more memorable melody that feels almost Egyptian or something. I thought it was going to be my least favorite on first listen, but it has been one of the easiest ones to get into. And also that big wash of bass a little before the 2-minute mark just absolutely gives me life. And then there's The End Is Nigh. I did say that this was the pre-album single that gave me the most hope for this album, the one I most immediately enjoyed, feeling like it could make for an excellent deep cut. Hearing it in context of the album, though, showed this track not to be just any random deep cut, but rather the big, hard-hitting climax of the album. And, honestly, this is probably my favorite track on the album now that I've heard it in context. What first drew me in was how it didn't sound like any other Orbital track I'd heard before. The weird and off-kilter female voices that seemed to do more panting and grunting than singing, and all the dark sections with no melody contrasting with the super bright and flashy main melodic sections. And it just hits so hard. What this track reminds me of is, like, the world is ending around you and you decide, okay, if we're all gonna die in the next couple of hours anyways, let's have a party! Like, we're just headbanging and living it up while the building we're inside is being demolished and the world around is full of smoldering, burning wreckage. And once we do all die, we're gonna go down laughing and holding up both middle fingers. Just absolutely badass track. Probably the one on here that could most easily make it into my countdown video. Probably not top 10, but I think it has a good chance at the top 20. Might barely get the edge over, I don't know, Funny Break One Is Enough. I'd have to look back at my list to know for sure, though. And that leaves our closer, There Will Come a Time with Brian Cox. I got mixed feelings on this one, honestly. I mean, it's probably the weakest closer to an Orbital album we've got so far. Now, that's not saying much, given that the previous contenders for worst Orbital closer were probably Belfast and Meltdown, both of which are awesome. And this is also a brilliant way to end the album. Like the previous track saw the world ending, and now here's a track where this scientist is talking about how insignificant the human race is in the grander scheme of things, how we're all going to die eventually, and asking us to think about how to deal with it. Now, I've heard people say that this track would have worked better without Brian Cox's narration, and I disagree on that point. I really like the things that Cox is saying, and again, I can easily imagine middle schooler me hearing this and having an existential crisis. I feel like this is the kind of thing that I wish big world leaders would hear and actually really think about and process. Not that some of them necessarily would, but you know. The trouble with this track and what's prevented it from being a personal favorite on the album is that I feel like this instrumental is most concerned with being a backing track to Brian Cox than being a solid Orbital track in its own right. Sure, it's grand in scale and is very fitting for the stuff Cox is talking about, and that melody of alien whistling is pretty easily memorable. But once Cox is done talking, Orbital are basically done too. They could have gone a lot further with this if you ask me, add more to this big cosmic sounding instrumental and let it go on longer without the narration. It's another track that had the potential to be one of those big 9-minute plus epics, but didn't live out that potential. As many times as I've listened to this album, and as much as I feel its importance in the context of the album, I don't think it's ever been marked as one of my personal favorites. And that's every track on here, but I'll also quickly talk about the bonus tracks in Disc 2. Like I briefly mentioned before, I think all the bonus tracks are glorified demos, and I think the album proper is probably better off without their inclusion. But I also feel like there's a lot of cool ideas here that you could have worked into the proper tracks. Now, my two favorite of the bonus tracks are easily the first two. Kaiju is kind of like another darker Copenhagen-type track that's really the only one fleshed out enough to work on its own merits. And A Long Way From Home is a minute and a half, like, spacey guitar-driven piece that creates this really effective and lonely atmosphere. I like listening to this track directly following There Will Come a Time. Like, if it was added on as an outro, I think that really could have added a lot. And even brought that track up to about the length of One Perfect Sunrise. Even if it is really obvious Phil had nothing to do with this particular piece, I think it still would have worked really well in that context. The rest of the bonus tracks are fine, I guess. A lot of unfinished synth doodles that didn't do a ton for me personally, as well as an instrumental of There Will Come a Time, which feels really empty, and I stand by my opinion that it's not better with Brian Cox removed. And there's a pretty neat remix of Tiny Foldable Cities too, I guess. I'm told there's a third disc as well with their Kinetic 2017 and Copenhagen singles, as well as an alternate take of the bonus track to Dream Again and a live-style version of Where Is It Going, but I don't think I personally will be all that interested in it given I was already lukewarm on the singles, and I downloaded 2 of their live sets with that Where Is It Going extended version. So yeah, probably will be skipping out on that disc, but yeah, that's Monsters Exist. Overall, yeah, I do definitely have my problems with it, but I think in the end, I'm a lot more impressed with what I got than I am itching for those problems to be resolved. I think it's managed to stay up to Orbital's lofty standards in spite of not having any of the nostalgia factor that the other Orbital albums have for me, and in spite of my serious dread going into it that they dropped the ball. I can confirm they delivered on this one. As for the final rating, this was probably the hardest part of this review for me to decide. It's still pretty surreal that I am covering an Orbital album this quickly after its release. That's why I waited like a full week to post this video, to really familiarize myself and not feel like I was going to rate it prematurely. And I do know my opinion is liable to change in the future once it's dug its way into my life some more. If I go purely based on my personal enjoyment right at this current moment, just the gut emotional reaction, it's probably a solid 8. Still great, but lower than the others thanks to its newness. But I don't feel like that does justice to my feelings on the album as a whole, because it did a lot of things that I'm really glad it did. I really think this is their most well-realized album in a really long time, and I love the way it comes together as a whole, and how I can get into basically every track out of context. I'm more impressed with this Orbital album than I have been by basically everything they've done after the Altogether, even if it doesn't get quite the same emotional rise out of me as other related projects. With that taken into account, I think my final rating on Monsters Exist is an 8.7 out of 10. I think it's excellent and worth a purchase for any longtime Orbital fan, so I'll leave it at that for now. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. If you want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, the link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.